Hello and welcome to How to Read Your Chart Without Panicking. I am Jessica of Northern Atlas, and today we are going to be going over a few concepts from the DIY Astro Readings course that I created with 5 different lessons and multiple modules within those lessons. And then we're going to look at a chart example to start putting those concepts into practice and getting started with understanding step by step how we can start to look at our own chart. And then at the end, I'm going to present some information on ways to learn more, specifically with a group of astro enthusiasts. Okay, let's dive into it. So, as we learned in DIY Astro Readings, the free mini course that I had on offer, we learned about the history and the historical context, went into quite a bit of detail compared to what's written on the screen here. Quite a bit of detail on the historic timelines, as well as some key figures from those different eras and timeframes. And, people like Ptolemy, who came up in the first lesson, we circle back around to him at the last lesson. But before I get ahead of myself, just want to give you all a refresher here for those of you that took the DIY course, and provide some context for those of you that are new to this material. So talked about the cosmology and how really the history is all about how we got to now. So the fact that, modern day science and astronomy, we understand the solar system and the universe and the galaxy and so on from this perspective of a heliocentric. So everything is in our solar system is rotating around the sun. That was my cat, if you could hear that. Whereas astrology comes from a geocentric cosmos, and this idea that the Earth was central, largely because we can look up and see that we are moving, but it doesn't feel that way. So it's one of those fourth dimensional things that it's hard to, despite the fact that we live on this rotating, rock in space, it does appear as if everything is rotating around us. And that's something to keep in mind. I think that really, really helps us grasp the concepts of the 3-dimensional solar system and galaxy being transformed into a 2-dimensional chart. So this is where we get ideas around the different spheres and sort of who has dominion over them in terms of the planets. So, the ancients referred to the planets as wandering stars. So they're different from the fixed stars. And it really did seem like they were orbiting around us. And these are, of course, the 5 planets, along with the sun and the moon, also known as luminaries, that were, lost my words here. Let me pause. The 5 planets, that are visible to the naked eye, or by the naked eye. So this was pre-technology, aka pre-telescopes. So these were for thousands of years, actually. These were celestial bodies in the sky that were just being observed by the human eye, which tells us a lot about the impact of electricity in our modern world as well. And then the last point is, this idea of the ether, and how, regardless of what you would be totally lost the word again, regardless of what you feel like calling it. Ether is, source, it's God, it's heaven, it's the unknown place, this place that we feel we have a connection to because we all came from there, but we don't have any solid memory or proof. And I like to posit in a very casual, non-scientific way that, there's dark matter, and scientists are just like, we don't know what this is. And then, not too long ago, they were like, okay, now there's this thing called gray matter, and we know even less about that. And I like to think of, gray matter as like, oh, that's like the heart of the cosmos or something. But who knows? Who knows if we'll learn in my lifetime? And then this is if I say so myself, a beautiful graphic on the different spheres. And, we really fixate on the band of the zodiac, the animals, as it's also known, as well as the planets, the 7 traditional planets. And then we focus on the elements as well, and the elemental realms. So that's what we're discussing, and that's kind of what's on the docket. And we also talked about the Thema Mundi, and this is, the longer I've been doing astrology, the more appreciation I have for this. I mean, it's called a learning tool, so I don't really know what I was expecting. Don't know why I'm quite so surprised. But yeah, it's a really effective tool that places, at the dawn of civilization, as it's called, or the flooding of the Nile River in Egypt. This is where ostensibly the different visible planets, the wandering stars, were. And, again, scientifically, we can look and say, okay, the moon may have been in Cancer, the sun may have been in Leo. It's not as likely that Mercury could have been all the way in Virgo. It's not as likely that Venus could have been all the way in Libra, because the degrees of these planets can't ever get that far away from one another. So the sun, Mercury, and Venus, they are in such close proximity to the sun as well as to us, to Earth, that it's really challenging. I don't know that we could say that would have happened. But, we keep in mind that the tools that were available at this time are very, very different than the tools that, the precision that we can get to. And I mean, we weren't there in the room when people, the powers that be, were like, yeah, let's go with the Thema Mundi, guys. But it did happen because we've still got it today. So this is where it comes from, the fact, quote unquote fact, that the luminaries were in Cancer and Leo, and Mercury was in Virgo, Venus was in Libra, Mars was in Scorpio, Jupiter was in Sagittarius, and Saturn in Capricorn. And then when we sort of fold the chart in half, we see this duplication. So we've got, a mirror image of Mercury ruling Gemini, Venus ruling Taurus, Mars ruling Aries, Jupiter ruling Pisces, and then side by side, the double whammy, Saturn ruling Aquarius. And this is where we get the idea of dignity, which is not as judgmental a term as it sounds. But so domicile is a big part of dignity, planetary dignity. It's also thematically and historically, I would argue, interconnected and related to this idea of rulership and what it means to be a ruler, what it has meant to be a ruler, how like across cultures that has ebbed and flowed and changed. Um, I don't know a huge amount of like ancient world history, but I was lucky enough to learn, a number of units on different civilizations. Um, and yeah, this idea that like, Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius, and how they rule is going to look very different from how Jupiter rules. So, when planets are traveling into spaces that are not under their own rulership, they are, we could say, at the mercy of these other planets. But like, why do we feel compelled to say at the mercy, right? Like rulership can mean I have responsibility over you. Okay, like you're under my charge. Like somebody who has responsibility, let's think of that as like a babysitter. So okay, like a planet, let's say Venus, has come into Capricorn, that space is under the responsibility of Saturn. So there are some connections where, the planets are just happy to be in certain houses. And yeah, maybe they're not in a dignified sign, but they're happy to be in a certain part of the chart. So that's some food for thought as we move into learning more about astrology in general and how to read your chart without panicking. So just keep in mind that there's a lot of terms that we can parse out and we can really sit with and feel into, because as you start looking at your own chart, it's important to recognize the language that you're using as well. So if, for instance, you're trying to understand like, okay, why am I moving house so much? Like if you're trying to look at, your home or your foundation in your chart, it's important for you to recognize like, well, what do I define as a home? Is a home where my family of origin is a home wherever I happen to be, is a home where like my partner or my best friend is. And did I feel safe in what is traditionally known as a home? So that was a bit of a segue, but just wanted to, plant that seed that there is a lot of language of astrology, which I love, but it can get a bit overwhelming at times. So taking that pause and that reflection and checking in with yourself to just say like, I'm using this word. I'm using this word like domicile, a home or a dwelling. What is my relationship to home? Am I afraid of my home? Did I build my home with my own bare hands? Like what does that relationship look like? Because as you move to potentially reading for other people, whether that's professionally or for fun, or something in between, they'll have a different idea of what home is as well. All right, so let's go over the planets. So the luminaries, the sun and the moon, are a little confusingly considered planets in the context of Hellenistic traditional astrology. So they are set apart from the other planets because they have a quality of light. So the sun quite obviously, it's a star. It's this, dying piece of cosmic rock. And that creates light. It creates enough light and heat for many, 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 many species to exist and to, in fact, thrive here on Earth. And the moon reflects that light. And it reflects the light in the area of the world that is not currently seeing the sun. So that's pretty cool. Something else that sets these two apart is that neither of them have retrograde motion. So the sun, we say, again, from this geocentric point of view, we say that the sun is moving through the different zodiac signs. And technically speaking, the sun does not move because we're moving around it, but the apparent motion through the sky makes it look as though the sun is in the different zodiac signs. And yeah, the moon, despite having a different phase and rotating around us, does not ever appear retrograde. So the inferior planets actually does include the moon. I just wanted to talk about the moon and the sun together and have them separate from the rest of the planets. And the term inferior and superior is definitely not a moral judgment. So this just indicates whether they are below, which is inferior, or above, which is superior, the orbit of the sun, again, from that geocentric viewpoint. So Mercury, we've got here, also known as Hermes, and Venus, also known as Aphrodite. I love this painting of them. I've never seen it before. I found it for this course, but I'm just in love with it now. Anyway, Mercury is the fastest moving planet besides the moon, which is a luminary. Confusing. So Mercury is the fastest moving planet, and they're known as the messengers of the gods, sorry. And Venus is the brightest planet in the sky, and it has a very similar diameter and surface area and volume to Earth. So it's often referred to as like our sister planet. Then we have the superior planets. So this is Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And Mars is known as the red planet. It appears red with like a basic telescope. And it's topographically, I thought this was really cool. It's known for its supervolcanoes and ancient floodplains. Like, it's so cool to think of astrology and like the Thema Mundi as having occurred, like come into life and into being and into our civilization history that we can study today through the flooding of what would have at one point been a plain, like a floodplain. So rivers are just fascinating to me, and I just think that's so cool that Mars like has that shared history, I guess, in its own way with us. And then we've got what are called the social planets. So Jupiter and Saturn, they're further away from us than Mars or Venus or Mercury. And Jupiter is referred to as the gas giant. These, by the way, are more like pop science terminology rather than astrologically informed. But I really think that having an appreciation of astronomy helps so much when understanding the how of astrology. And also because there's a lot of like naysayers that are like, they spend their lives like communing with the cosmos, and then they're like, Like astrology is so dumb. And it's just always such a shock to me. So I think it's important to, historically, there was like such a quote unquote enlightened time in the Western history where we mixed art and science. And I think that we desperately need to go back to that. So this is my effort to spread that and to share that that really like joyful connection and interconnection of science and the arts. So anyway, what a digression. Um, so this is the largest planet in our solar system. And it has, I didn't know this before this course, but it has an anticyclone. First of all, I barely know what a cyclone is. So an anticyclone, I'm just like, does that go out of the Jupiter's atmosphere? Does that go into its core? Like, I don't know. I don't have the answers. Or does it appear to just go the opposite direction? Anyway, it is like twice the diameter. It's bigger than twice the diameter of Earth. So just like puts us into perspective a little bit. And then Saturn. So this is the furthest planet that we can see and have seen with the naked eye. And its rings are actually often, quite often, visible using like an amateur telescope. You don't need to be in an observatory. And another cool thing that I learned in advance of this course, the rings are made of ice particles. And it's like located on or in the plane of Saturn's equator. And it's like, oh, cool. Like we have an equator. It makes sense that other planets would have an equator as well. But like how different Saturn's atmosphere must be to have these ice particles. And I think that's really telling as well, because when we look at the planets and their astrological significations, their themes, their meanings, distance and like coldness, that always comes up for Saturn. So remembering that, like, oh yeah, Saturn is so far from the sun that there are literally ice particles wrapped around its equator that we can see with like really rudimentary technology. So those are the 7 planets. So next we can talk about the zodiac. This is something that I feel is super popular, to talk more from the perspective of the signs rather than, the planets. A lot of people are sort of identifying as like, well, I'm an Aries, or, oh, you're nothing like a Leo. I don't know that you should ever say that to a Leo. They all took an oath. But yeah, I wanted to share, the I've lost the word again. I wanted to share the different sort of categorization that we have for the zodiac. And I think that it's a really helpful way to look at and sort of keep in mind and sort of group together. So the modes or modality is how we can categorize the different signs. And the helpful thing here to note is that every sign within each of these 3 groupings it like opposes one another. I hope I'm making sense. So, a cardinal sign is Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. So we've got one fire sign, we've got one water sign, one air sign, one earth sign. So we've got all 4 elements here. And in this case, with the cardinal signs, we have all 4 signs are ruled by different planets. So Aries is ruled by Mars, Cancer is ruled by the moon, Libra is ruled by Venus, and Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. And Aries and Libra oppose one another, and Cancer and Capricorn oppose one another. So these two and these two, they are on the same axis as their counterpart, as their other. And they can feel, because of that, quite opposing. But something that's really important, I think, to understand in astrology, as well as like life in general, is that when we exist on like the opposing end of like another person, like a belief system or what have you, um, what you feel is the exact same, right? You're feeling like I have this deep responsibility and this, um, this almost burden to care this much about, either loving or hating this thing, right? We're often pitted against one another from this like love versus hate perspective. And what's helped me to kind of map this onto my day-to-day life is that, the cardinal signs are all motivated by the same thing. The Some of the best work that can be done leveraging these signs is starting and beginning something, because these all identify the start of a new season, and they identify either the equinoxes or the solstices. Solstices, awkward word to say. But I do love solstices. So I'll maybe keep babbling while I talk about the fixed signs here. So again, we've got Taurus and Scorpio on opposing ends of one another. So we've got an earth sign, a fire sign, a water sign, and an air sign. So we've got all the elements again. And in a fixed sign, again, that modality, the motivating priority for all four of these, even though it may appear to manifest in very different and opposing ways, they're all concerned with, stability. The power that lies in these signs is, a constancy. And then we have the last of the three categories, the mutable signs. So we've got an air sign, an earth sign, a fire sign, and a water sign. The mutable signs, interestingly enough, are the only category, the only mode that has, they've only got two rulers. So Gemini and Virgo, they're both mutable. Gemini is air sign, Virgo is earth sign, but they're both ruled by Mercury. And then Sagittarius and Pisces, we've got a fire sign, we've got a water sign, but they're both ruled by Jupiter. And they do not oppose one another. They oppose, Gemini opposes Sagittarius, Virgo opposes Pisces. So we start to see the different relationships subtly interweaving like we did on the Thema Mundi. So next we will move on to the houses. So the houses, I think, becomes a bigger theme when you start looking at charts as a whole. So it's really good to, keep this kind of diagram nearby, as you're working through, okay, how am I going to read this chart, even begin to read this chart. So another way that we categorize in astrology is with the houses. So there is different quadrants. So the chart is divided into, the chart is divided into four quadrants. That is true, but that was not the word that I'm looking for. So the, I've lost the word again. I don't know what's going on here. Anyway, 12, 11, and 10, that's the first quadrant. 9, 8, 7, that's the second. 6, 5, 4, that's the third. 3, 2, 1, that's the fourth. And then each quadrant is divided 3 times. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at this is that, planets rise in descending order. Is that, did I use language correctly? So 12, 11, 10, the first house is like the eastern horizon. So if my mouse here is a planet, it's rising up past the ascendant sign. We'll say that's in the middle. And it rises into the 12th, into the 11th, throughout the day, into the 10th, into the 9th, into the 8th. So, the sun, for instance, would do that each day. So the lower half of the chart is, the nighttime, and the upper half of the chart is the daytime. And then this is where we start to get into this idea of moving something that is 3-dimensional into a 2-dimensional setting. So the houses become these static reference points. They're not supposed to move. And when I say that, we're using whole sign in this course, but there is like Placidus, which looks to be changeable. Like if I put my birth date details in to a Placidus chart, mine doesn't look very different between whole and Placidus, but versus if I put your birth details into a Placidus chart, those houses will look different. But the idea that they are a static reference point still remains. So the themes are still relevant. So even if your 10th house, is this big, the theme is the exact same. And so we've got angular houses, succedent houses, and cadent houses. So the angular houses are the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th. And this is going to come up again when we get to the actual how-to section of this webinar. And then we've got succedent houses. So angular houses, I should clarify, angular houses are called as such because they host the angles. So they host the ascendant and descendant, which is the self and the other. And they host in the 4th and the 10th, respectively, the IC, the Imam Coeli, and the MC, also known as the midheaven. And so these angles, they are not actual physical bodies or points in space. They are calculations, but they're very important. So the succedent houses, they're referred to as the houses that like prop up the preceding houses. And it's always a little confusing, I find, because it's hard to look at, 1, 2 going in a counterclockwise direction and saying, okay, an angular house is succeeding, it's coming after the second house. On paper, which this is the whole point of having these houses, that we can put them on paper in a 2-dimensional capacity. On paper, it did not make sense automatically to me. So if this part is tripping you up, don't worry about it too much. So the succedent houses, as you can see, they are propping up. 7 is propping up 8, 5, here we go, doesn't really look like it's propping up 4, but I guess if you spun the wheel, it would. And then 2 is holding up 1. And then the last category is cadent houses. So this is the 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 12th. And these are the houses that are considered to fall away from the angles. So whatever comes after the succedent, whatever comes after, quote unquote, after the angular houses. So 12 comes after 1, 9 comes after 10, 6 comes after 7, and 3 comes after 4. So it's a hard lesson. I found it a hard lesson to learn and clearly articulate, but I think that this is really important to recognize that, like, okay, yeah, I do have to get this 3-dimensional solar system and spatial awareness and physics onto a sheet of paper. Of course, that's going to seem counterintuitive at first. So like I said, we can keep it cool. If you have any trouble with this part, let me know. And then the last moment before we get to the chart is the aspects. So this is like the plot of the chart. And aspects are definitely relevant in things like predictive astrology, so like transits and secondary progression and things like that. But they're just as important to the natal chart. Because they can point out, issues that, or conversations, they don't have to be bad, that go on and sort of run within us naturally. So these are what are called the telemic aspects. I mentioned him, in the first lesson, the first module. So these are the aspects that get utilized and leveraged in traditional Hellenistic astrology. There are other more, I guess, technically speaking, more modern, more modern than Ptolemy, that can be used as well. But I would argue that it's helpful to start with a smaller crew and then work your way out, So we've got the conjunction. So this is when planets are at like 0 degrees from one another, which means there's no space between them. They're in the same sign. They're probably side by side. And then there's oppositions. That's 180 degrees. And this is when planets oppose one another. So they're unified, like I said, when we talked about the signs, unified by the same mode. So if one planet is in Aries, and another planet is in Libra, they're opposing one another from 2 of the 4 cardinal signs. And each of these aspects, not including the conjunction, but these other aspects are ruled by, in a sense, different planets. So Saturn is the de facto ruler of oppositions, because it's all about like relational choices and that term again, responsibility. So there's often like a good analogy for this is like balancing something either on scales or on a seesaw. And usually it means that there's like a choice that needs to be made. Then we have a trine. So these planets are in signs of the same element, and that allows their actions to combine with ease. So because it's Jupiter's aspect at 120 degrees, It's this idea of like generosity, gifts, bounty, and or just like general abundance that's either being had or shared or like given to one another. The next aspect is sextile, and that is Venus's signs. This is when planets are 60 degrees from one another, which puts them in signs of different elements, but the same gender and temperature, which that creates an agreeable relationship. And it's sort of this like how my teacher described it was like holding hands. So it's a very like harmonious relationship between the two planets, but it's not as automatic or as like, impressive as the trines beneficial relationship. And then at 90 degrees, we have the square. So this is when planets are in signs who share the same mode. So Capricorn and Aries, for instance, but they have different temperatures. And this creates a relationship of friction. So this is Mars's aspect, and that means that there is usually like a focus on a hierarchy of like one of us has to get to where they're going, because if they were to sort of travel like across across the chart, they would bump into one another. So it's this idea that, if you're getting on like a train and the doors are open wide, but there's lots of people coming in and out, a square is kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to go and I might bump into somebody, or I might like, pull my shoulder against the bar while I'm trying to get in. And so it can often create this sense of like frustration, because it's like, yeah, okay, I got on the train, but my shoulder is hurt and like dislocated now. So there definitely is this sort of like, haha, I won, you lost kind of attitude. And especially depending on which planets are squaring one another. Not every planet would act like that. Okay, so now we get to the fun, exciting part, the chart. So just a reminder, when we're putting these pieces together, we can look at it through this somewhat hierarchical lens of, prioritizing the planets, zodiac houses, and aspects. And we can do that just as a way to help us actually tell the story, and give us some order and structure. Because again, the point and the purpose behind astrology was always to create order out of chaos. So with that being said, just a reminder that the planets are kind of like the what of the story, or the who. So we've got these sort of characters that represent different energies that are present in all of us. And the zodiac likewise gives us the language around that lens or that perspective that the planets are presenting their energies, or like manifesting their energies in the world. And then the houses are very specific to us, to our charts. And the houses tell us which areas of our lives we will be seeing this manifestation come to light and come to being. And then finally, we have the aspects, which I like to conceptualize as the plot of the chart, or the sort of dialogue, conversations that are happening between the characters. So here are some general guidelines. So step one, whether it's your own chart or somebody else's, always make sure that before launching into anything, just double check that you've got your correct birth data, as well as you've got it input correctly. So if someone, gave you AM versus PM, that's going to wildly change what the chart is going to look like, which is kind of crazy to think about. And the next step is figuring out whether you have a day chart or a night chart. Then I recommend looking at the angles and assessing which signs the ascendant, descendant, IC, and MC are located in. And then I recommend looking at the sun, moon, and rising. So assessing the conditions, which is the sign and the house in this case, of the sun, the moon, and the chart ruler. So that's the planet which rules the sign of your ascendant. So I've got a pretty recognizable figure here. This is Marilyn Monroe, and I wanted to look at her chart. So for example, this is Marilyn Monroe's chart. And because the sun is in the upper hemisphere of the chart, it's in the one of the 12th to 7th houses. This is a day chart. So even though the moon is above that, that horizon line as well, it's considered a day chart. So next, we've got the angles. So the 1st and 7th house, and then the 4th and 10th house. So she has a Leo ascendant, a Aquarius descendant, and then she's got a Scorpio IC and a Taurus MC. And I've put over here who rules all of these. So for her rising sign, we're going to look to the sun. For her descendant, we're going to look to Saturn. For her IC, we're going to look to Mars. And then for her MC, we're going to look to Venus. So right away, before we even, expand from here, we've already got a lot of information that we can start to embody. We can start to be like, okay, day chart versus night chart. So we've got a diurnal personality or priority, we could say. We also know that all of her angles are situated in fixed signs. And her IC as well as her DC descendant have the co-presence of other planets, or of planets, I should say, though they are not conjunct. They're not a close conjunction. And then looking at her sun, moon, and rising, we've got this sense of, okay, her sun's in the 11th house in Gemini, her moon is in Aquarius, the 7th house, and her rising is, of course, in Leo. So we're coming back around to the sun. Suddenly we're seeing the sun as this very important figure. So that feeds into the chart ruler, and we can say that the sun, steers her ship. So right away from the chart, we can say, all right, what am I going to prioritize? How am I going to get to know my chart in this way? And something else that I wanted to reference is that Mercury, so we've established the sun is very important in Marilyn Monroe's chart. And Mercury is as well, because Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, which is where her sun is. So that not only is that where her sun is located and the area of life that she feels very responsible for, but it's hand in hand, it's connected in that three-legged race with the ruler of Gemini. So because this is a diurnal chart, because the sun is a big figure in the chart in more ways than one, if this was your chart, I would say, let's look at the sun. Let's see how you connect with the sun, and what your relationship to, communicating with like an audience might look like. So the sun, we know, is choleric. It's hot and dry. It's diurnal, which represents an active expression. And it's in Gemini, which is a mutable sign ruled by Mercury, which is sanguine, so not quite as dry. It's more of a moist perspective or fluid perspective manifestation. and diurnal as well. So overall, the sun in the 11th house, like this is a pretty nice space for the sun to be. He's pretty content. He's not like exalted. It's not, you know, there's not a lot of fanfare happening necessarily, but it's a good space, and he's probably pretty comfortable. And also the sun in the 11th in Mercury sign. So the 11th house is audiences. And what we do know of Marilyn Monroe is that she had a very, I'm not sure what the best term is, but a really overwhelming relationship to her public. She would perform for throngs of people. She would, walk through places like New York City, and be like relatively unrecognizable. And there's this very famous, or perhaps infamous, exchange in which she was with her close friend and photographer, Milton Green. And they were walking in New York, and she wasn't really being identified, and no one was really surrounding her like they normally would. And, apparently, she said, "Do you want to see me become her?" And she didn't change her clothing. She didn't, rip off a wig or anything. She simply embodied the character of Marilyn Monroe for the people, in the street and near the subway, and was immediately recognized. So, because this is a public chart of a public figure, this is something that we can kind of think back on those stories and say, like, okay, does this story connect to this sun placement in any way? And, the idea that the sun and Mercury is known for being playful, being a bit of a trickster, a magician who can, conjure and glamour and so on. It really reminds me, seeing this placement, it reminds me of this story that I remember learning about her. And that's the kind of sort of tenderness that we can approach our own charts with. So next I would look at the sun's aspects. So the sun, like I said, is conjunct and actually combust, which is not an aspect, but an important thing to note. So it's conjunct Mercury, and because they're so close, I believe I've covered the degree now, but I believe they are close enough to be combust. So the sun is a little domineering over Mercury in this relationship. And then the sun has aspects to the angles, two of the angles. And the reason I wanted to mention this is because, so the angles are not, real planetary bodies in the sky, but they are fixed points that are calculated based on like our presence in the world, which I think is very empowering. And I think it's important to make note of the fact that the planet can see, okay, that's this like symbolic time that you showed up, that you were added to, to the herd, to the flock. And so the sun can see the ascendant, which means the chart ruler, the sect leader, can see the first house very clearly, which means that there's this, and it's a sextile, I should say. And that means that the planet sort of in charge of the chart in multiple ways has a very like harmonious and clear relationship between that responsibility and that focus of like the person, the audience, and their own like countenance, their own appearance, which makes absolute sense when we think in context of Marilyn Monroe. This is somebody who, to this day, there's always always seemingly going to be reflections on her. She has so many photographs, so many iconic photographs. And then, shortly after her death, like an iconic uh, creation, piece of artwork by Andy Warhol, in her homage kind of thing. So this idea that she had a clear reciprocal relationship between her countenance and her physical body and appearance to her public and to her audience, that really comes across whenever you see, archival footage of her just being in the presence of other people. She was always so elated. So then we're not going to go into all of the rulers of the Angles, but the next step would be looking at the rulers of the Angles and what kind of position they're in and what kind of conversations they're having with one another and with the planets that are in the signs that they are responsible for. So at this point, we would use like planetary dignity and the criteria involved in that, which was just too extensive to go into for the DIY astro readings course, but is going to be featuring in the Astro Academy, which I'm going to be mentioning shortly. So I wanted to give the example of Saturn. I was really drawn to the fact that she has Saturn in the fourth house, ruled by Mars in Pisces. I also have Mars in Pisces. That's very cute. So her Saturn, it's 21 degrees in Scorpio. It is retrograde as well. And it's in the fourth house. So the fourth house is that house of family of origin, of lineage, of ancestry, that symbolic house of roots and sort of the connections that we have to land as well. And it's interesting seeing Saturn here for her, because again, what I do know of her childhood and early days, it was not a pleasant or safe experience. And this idea that, Saturn is the ruler of constriction, and the ruler of, responsibility, and choice, and the fact that, we're so young when we have our fourth profection year, the very first profection year. So yeah, this idea that she is, or she was somebody that, had that cold and dry, melancholic planet situated in the fixed water sign of Scorpio, which is sort of known for keeping itself protected and having this sort of like no entry sign that Saturn puts up there. The fact that her name was never Marilyn Monroe, her name was Norma Jean. The fact that her childhood and her like adolescence was just apparently riddled with dangerous situations and oppression. And I'm not trying to say that if you have Saturn here, you've been oppressed or that you have been mistreated by your family. But again, we can see that, okay, this story that was a reality for her lived experience could potentially be explained and sort of mythologized through the presence of Saturn here in the fourth in Scorpio. A lot of this information became public, but it's not a role that she continued to play or to take on. She very much embodied the persona of Marilyn Monroe, despite having been born Norma Jean. And something else to mention is that Saturn makes an aspect to the moon. So, when we're going deeper, most astrologers that I have spoken with or learned from, watched any sort of talk from, there seems to be this overall agreement that it's impossible to get to say, like, to get everything that a chart has to say. So, if you're dedicating an hour to your studies, kind of thing, you can get a lot done, you can get a lot addressed, but it will never feel like enough time has happened or has become available for you. And so the job or the trick and the fun challenge often becomes this sense of like, okay, what am I going to prioritize? And especially when it's for yourself, that can be really fun and a really fun way to spend an afternoon. And when it's for someone else, whether that's professionally or for fun or something in between, work with the other person to get a sense like, do you have specific questions? If there's specific questions about the areas of your life, that's when you would use the houses. And if they're general questions, that's when you would use the step 1 to 4 that I mentioned earlier. Studying our own charts really helps us, and it helps identify the differences and the similarities between, us and others, as well as between planets, between signs. You just start to see as many similarities as you do differences. And I really want to stress like how important it is to be open to that, because we just live in such a such a conflicted time where people have the exact same amount of vim and vigor around like a topic or an idea or an expression, and they feel so divided, and yet there's such a similarity to what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to convey. So connecting to your chart beyond reading it is really important as well. So it doesn't have to look good. It doesn't have to be this like beautiful thing that you present or share with anyone else. But the idea of, connecting with the planets each day of the week, the idea of hand drawing your chart or components of your chart, just help us to embody the information that's otherwise just sitting on a screen. It can feel very detached when we only look at it through astrological software. And something else that's really, really important, like making mistakes is part of the process. No one is expecting you to know absolutely everything there is to know about astrology, whether you've been studying it for 2 years, if you've been studying it for the past week, if you've been studying it for 10 years. There's no timeline. And there is like supreme joy to being a beginner. There's a level of like confidence that you can actually have when you get to like that sweet honeymoon spot of learning a new skill or learning new information. And it's important to just recognize like, oh, I didn't know that this was a thing. So for instance, for the longest time, I didn't know anything about the nodes. And I thought that the nodes, because of where mine are, I just assumed, okay, I'll learn about that later someday. And in the meantime, until I did, I had assumed that the nodes were always in close contact to the ascendant and descendant, just because that's how it looks in my chart. And it wasn't, they're not an astrological body that I felt I had enough access of information to. So I had an idea of what it might be, and it turned out to be wrong, and that's totally okay. And it's, a cute story from my journey into astrology. So, collect those, make mistakes, and just try things out, and look at charts that exist, create random charts from, random days of the year moving forward, from the past. Check out family members if they're willing to share their information, and friends as well. There's no shortage of people on Earth that we can draw inspiration from in terms of leveraging their, public persona and their birth date information so that we can learn and we can get better and we can really synthesize and understand. So I mentioned at the beginning, I did want to share, and I'm very excited to share that I'm going to be running the Astro Academy. This is an 11-week astrology embodiment course. So it's a trauma-sensitive astrology course that teaches you how to understand and embody astrology, not just technically, right? Like we went through some technical information earlier in this presentation, but spiritually unlocking the meaning of astrology so that we can feel seen, so that we can feel heard, and so that we can feel witnessed and held by the universe, by ourselves, and by other people as well. When I started learning astrology in a group environment, my world opened up and I became close friends with people that could speak the same sort of language as me. And it went like across cultures, it went across like countries of origin, it went across like ages and gender expressions. I was able to meet people where we were all at. And that has felt like such a blessing and has really inspired me to offer this program so that there can be yet another container for people to learn and connect and use a shared language together. So the logistics of the Astro Academy, there's going to be bi-weekly pre-recorded information. So quite an expansion on what's available in the DIY Astro Readings mini course. So that will be available at the top of the week. And then we'll be having bi-weekly live gatherings. So the same week that there's a pre-recorded lesson, there's going to be alternating between office hours, which is informal, and it's very much about the lessons themselves, if there's any clarification needed. And then the alternating form of the live gathering is like group mentorship. So you would sign up, in other realms, it's called something like hot seat coaching, stuff like that. So we would have roughly, like, depending on the amount of people that were there in a day and the amount of people that signed up, you'd have some dedicated coaching time together. And then biweekly prompts. I'm really excited for this. These would be guided opportunities to embody your chart and the astrology that impacts you. And this will be both for the lessons that you're learning in the program, but then also, resources and templates to help guide you if you want to go further in other directions like predictive astrology and forecasting and things like that. And then there's also a bonus. There's a Discord channel, which will be private and dedicated to the Academy. So it would be a space that you can go as a member to connect with other members between those live sessions and connect on those prompts and those guides. And just like go for inspiration, go for witnessing, go for like study hour kind of thing. And if you would like one-on-one support, we can do that as well. So that would be an add-on, but that would be bi-weekly, and that'll be limited to a certain number of members. And the idea is that we'll just have a half hour together where no other distractions, no interruptions. It's just going to be you and me. And it can be really based on your priorities and what you're hoping to work through. So that's all for learning how to read your chart without panicking. There's lots of resources, there's lots of support. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And I'll talk to you later.